evening. I'm Tracie Dorfman, Development Director at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation, Jews in Space, a sneak peek, with JMM staff members Tracie Guy Decker and Trillian Attwood. Tonight's event concludes our series of programs commemorating the 51st anniversary of the landing on the moon. However, for those passionate about space, fear not, there's one more to come once we open our next exhibit, Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit. Tonight you will get a special sneak preview of the exhibit before it's on view to the public. For those of you who prefer regular travel to space travel, don't miss our Jewish Museums Across the Seas series next month, where we will travel to different Jewish museums around the world via Zoom. We will share registration details for these events at the end of this presentation. Now, our speakers. Tracie Guy Decker started as the Associate Director for Projects, Planning, and Finance in April of 2015. In that role, Ms. Guy Decker assisted the museum operations through administrative infrastructure support, including project management, oversight of facilities, maintenance and planning, budgets, and finance. Because most of her career has been spent in the marketing departments of nonprofit organizations, Ms. Guy Decker also oversees JMM's marketing activities. Prior to joining the museum, Guy Decker led marketing departments at Johns Hopkins University and the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater in Virginia Beach, Virginia. She holds a BA in English and Religion from Oberlin College and an MA in Religious Studies with a concentration in History of Judaism from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. Trillian Attwood is the JMM Director of Public Programs and Visitor Experience. In her role, she organizes public programs and events at the museum, including lectures, book talks, cooking demos, family and community programs, special events, and most recently, virtual presentations. She also manages partnerships and joint programs with various community organizations and museums. Before beginning work at JMM, Ms. Attwood lived in England, graduating from the University of Liverpool with honors with a BA and an MA in Egyptology. Trillian also graduated from the University of Leicester with an MA in Museum Studies.
Thank you, Tracie. It's always a little funny to hear myself referred to as Ms. Guy Decker, especially from the other Tracie on staff. Anyway, welcome everyone to a sneak peek of our next exhibit, Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit. The core of this exhibit, which will have its Maryland premiere on September 13th, God willing, was originally developed by the Center for Jewish History in New York. Tonight, Trillian and I will take turns walking you through some of the key sections of the upcoming exhibit. As Tracie mentioned, we actually recently celebrated the 51st anniversary of the famous One Small Step for Mankind. That was July 20th, in fact. And I have to admit that it is all history for me. I was born 7 years after that famous step was taken, but the icons of the space program still loomed large in my imagination. Sadly, as far as we can tell, there is nothing Jewish about John Glenn or Neil Armstrong, but as we re-examine the history of our modern attempts to touch the heavens, we find many hidden figures like Mary Jackson, for whom NASA headquarters has recently been renamed. No single ethnicity or religion has a monopoly on contributions to our explorations of the universe. I like to think of our upcoming exhibit as another effort to widen the lens through which we view America's recent past. Given the title of the exhibition, or the exhibit, excuse me, I probably don't need to tell you that it is not without a sense of humor. Our colleagues in New York looked to Mel Brooks when naming their exhibit. Brooks's History of the World Part 1 was released in 1981. I was 5. The film focused on Roman gladiators, the Inquisition as a Broadway musical, and the Court of Versailles. But Brooks just couldn't resist the shtick of putting in a preview of a coming attraction.
C. Jews in space!
Jews are in space, we're zooming along, protecting the Hebrew race. We're Jews are in space. If trouble appears, we'll put it right back in its place. When Goyim attack us, we give them a smack, we'll slap them right back in the face.
The Mel Brooks movie I remember most clearly from its release is Spaceballs. May the Schwartz be with you. But there is no History of the World Part 2, let alone a movie entitled Jews in Space. It's said that all humor contains a grain of truth, and our colleagues in New York made quite a loaf out of all of that grain. Their exhibit included 3 primary areas of connection between Jewish experiences and outer space. What you're looking at right now is called a bubble diagram. It's a kind of floor plan. So the main 3 sections that they had were information about cosmonauts and astronauts who have gone into orbit. And actually, let's take a break and do a poll. Can we do that now? So those of you listening, I want you to think about how many Jewish people have been out of our atmosphere. I'm not allowed to vote, so you all need to vote. Apparently my dog wants to vote. So here we go. So it looks like most of you thought it was 12. The real answer is 15. So in addition to that section of the exhibit about literal Jews in space, there is a section on the history of Jewish interests in astronomy and astrology, and a section on the role of outer space in the imagination of people of Jewish heritage. It turns out our community has a history of engagements in science fiction and popular culture. Since JMM's gallery is slightly larger than CJH's, we were given permission to add to the exhibit. So our additions include artifacts from our own collection, materials on the history of Maryland's contributions to space science, including the surprising importance of this state in the development of today's unmanned exploration of the galaxy, as well as a few special items that were close to the hearts of one or more JMM staffers.
Thank you, Tracy, and good evening, everybody. So as Tracy mentioned, the exhibit takes us through several sections. And as you may have already guessed, I am going to get us started with those Jewish individuals who have been lucky enough to actually go to space. At the time Mel Brooks created his faux trailer for Jews in Space, no American or Israeli Jewish astronaut had been sent into orbit. Not a single astronaut in the Mercury, Gemini, or Apollo crews was Jewish. However, over the last 36 years, things have really taken off. At this time, the number of Jewish individuals in the astronaut corps is roughly twice the percentage of self-identified Jews in the American population. The first Jewish spaceman is actually a cosmonaut rather than an astronaut. Boris Volynov, who you can see here, was the commander of Soyuz 5 mission, launched in January 1969. He was part of the first transfer of a crew from one spacecraft to another. Actually, this was Volonov's third scheduled mission. His crew had been scrubbed from 2 prior flights. It's unclear whether Volonov's Jewish heritage had anything to do with his being pulled from the earlier assignments, but there are certainly suspicions. Regardless, his first flight was a bumpy ride, ending with the module's parachute failing to fully deploy. This caused such a hard landing that it broke some of his teeth. Ouch. Dr. Judith Resnick grew up in California, but had Maryland ties. Her doctorate in electrical engineering is from the University of Maryland, and she served as a biomedical engineer at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda before joining NASA. Her voyage aboard the shuttle Discovery marked just the second time that an American woman went into space and the first time that an American Jew went into orbit. In her 145 hours in space, Dr. Resnick's mission specialty was the operation of the shuttle's robot arm. Now, though there'll be no opportunity to operate a shuttle robot arm in the exhibit, we do expect to have some artifacts that belong to Dr. Resnick, as well as tributes that were made after her tragic death at the launch of the shuttle Challenger in 1986. Ilan Wolferman's mother had survived Auschwitz before she and her husband emigrated to Israel in 1949. That's where Ilan was born in Ramat Gan outside Tel Aviv in 1954. Before joining the Israeli Air Force, Ilan decided that he needed a more Israeli last name and changed his name to Ramon, after the crater Ramon in Israel, shown here. While it's not unusual for a piece of geography to be named for a national hero, it is somewhat more unusual for a hero to adopt the name of a piece of geography. When he went into space in the shuttle Columbia in 2003, he made a point of carrying with him this drawing of a view of the Earth from the surface of the moon, made by a 14-year-old boy at Theresienstadt concentration camp. Ramon's first trip into space was unfortunately also his last, as he perished with the rest of his crewmates when the shuttle broke apart on re-entry over Texas. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that every Jewish journey into space has come to a bad end. Take, for example, the most recent Jewish astronaut in space, Jessica Meir. Dr. Meir was born in Caribou, Maine, the daughter of a Swedish mother who was a nurse, and an Israeli father who was a doctor. Jessica attended the Aristic Hebrew Community Synagogue in Prescott Isle, Maine. So before Jessica became an astronaut, she had another career with NASA. And so we're going to ask you to please take a look at our options here and see what you think it might have been. So you can vote. Our options are astronomer, aerospace engineer, food scientist, or aquanaut. All of which are careers that you could have within NASA. Okay, give it a little longer and see what we get. Okay, so interesting, no one went for astronomer. We have a lot of people going for aerospace engineer, and our lowest response was aquanaut with just 2 people, but I think those 2 of you probably know your stuff. That is exactly what Dr. Meir was doing with NASA prior to becoming an astronaut. So she earned her doctorate studying the penguins of Antarctica before she went on to become an astronaut. Just give me one moment. I'm just going to get us back into this screen share. You can see our slides. Okay. On her recent mission, she was not only a participant in the first all-female spacewalk, but she managed to function successfully for more than 204 days in space. Her landing was uneventful, that is apart from the unexpected extended quarantine when she found herself back on Earth. One of the highlights of the astronaut section of the exhibit is almost certainly a series of ritual artifacts put on loan to us by Dr. Jeffrey Hoffman, the first American Jewish man into space. Items on display will include the silver yard or Torah pointer that can be seen here. Dr. Hoffman is the very first person to read from a Torah in space, appropriately a passage from Bereshit. We'll also put on display his dreidel, which he helpfully demonstrated on one of the nights of Hanukkah on his third mission. Let's have a look.
In Endeavor, Houston, for Jeff, all of America would like to know what you've got and what you're doing with it.
Well, this is the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, and there's various ways that we celebrate it. And one of the games that we play is a little game with a dreidel, and it's something that you spin, and then you see which side comes up, and according to that, you either win or lose. And I was just trying to see how you might reinterpret the rules for spaceflight, since there's no up or down.
So aside from being an expression of ethnic pride, what significance, if any, can be attributed to twirling a dreidel on a space shuttle, or, for that matter, counting the number of Jewish astronauts? At least part of that answer lies in the history of Jews in space long before the first rocket would ever leave this planet.
So, where does the Jewish connection to space begin? In the beginning, of course. The very first sentence of the book, the Torah, speaks to the creation of the heavens. In that verse, we read, God called the light day and the darkness night, and it was evening and it was morning, one day. The rabbis understood these first few sentences to mean the universe was bathed in primordial light until the sun, moon, and stars took over on the fourth day. Those first few sentences describing the first week of existence became foundational assumptions for much of Jewish ritual. Some might argue the thrust of the Torah, indeed much of Jewish religion, is to bring order out of chaos. Torah is the home of the 613 mitzvot, and whether you call them commandments or blessings, they provide prescriptions, guidelines for human behavior. Significantly, those guidelines often use time to articulate the details of the behavioral prescriptions. You might call it the original space-time continuum. Rituals happen at a specific time, and historically the only way to mark time was to look into space. From antiquity, Jews took the first sentences of the Torah quite literally, believing that an evening followed by a morning constituted a day. This is why Jewish days begin and end at sundown rather than at midnight. And in traditional practice, hours were not exactly 60 minutes, but rather 1/12 of the time between sunset and sunrise, and then again 1/12 of the time between sunrise and sunset. This meant that in summer, a daytime hour might be 77 minutes long and an evening hour just 42 minutes. Given that the timing of prayers was linked to precise time of day, early Jewish sages debated the question of what was meant by sundown. Was it when the last rays of the sun were visible on the horizon? Was it about 18 minutes later when 3 stars, so-called secondary stars, were visible? This debate results in a Jewish concept of twilight, Bein Hashemshot, or literally between the suns. This is a sort of temporal no man's land that exists between the day that was and the day that will be. This importance of the setting sun to ritual observance led to a very robust Jewish astronomy. And if time was challenging here on Earth, it becomes even more complicated in the space age. Think for a moment of the special problem for an observant Jew in space associated with the question of when to pray, or in Yiddish, when to daven. The Jewish schedule of prayers is linked to sunsets and sunrises. But imagine you're in orbit. An orbiting space station typically passes through about 16 sunsets in a 24-hour span. Technically, this could mean that a Jewish astronaut would need to spend about 50% of his or her time praying. Some rabbinic authorities would insist that this is the only solution. But others argue that, in fact, this conundrum is the reason Jews should frankly avoid space travel. The most accepted answer, and the one that Ilan Ramon and Jeffrey Hoffman used for their journeys, is the suggestion that rituals be kept relative to your point of departure from Earth. So in other words, if you launch from Florida, the only sunset you need to worry about is the one in Florida. And the complexity of Jewish timekeeping is not restricted to hours. The months were enough to inspire generations of astronomical observation. As most of you listening are aware, Judaism follows what is called a lunisolar calendar, with a typical year consisting of 12 months, alternating between 29 and 30 days, matching the phases of the moon. Each month begins with a new moon. And in fact, in ancient times, official witnesses armed with diagrams of the moon's initial crescent would climb to the mountaintop and declare Rosh Chodesh, a new month. The problem with this approach is that the seasons are determined by a solar year. So if the lunar cycle is uncorrected, you eventually end up with Passover happening in the middle of winter. And in fact, that is what happens to our Muslim neighbors in their calendar, with Ramadan moving completely throughout the year. So a practice developed among early Jewish practitioners of periodically adding a leap month when the calendar threatened to become unhinged. Over time, the pattern for leap months was set to a metonic cycle of 19 years. So the numeric code that you see here on the screen is not the winning number in the lottery, I don't think, but rather the years in which leap months are added according to the metonic cycle. And the drawing on the screen that you see is from a circa 1922, a Yiddish text whose title I will not try to pronounce in Yiddish, which translates to a geography illustrated in relation to natural science, guidebook for teachers. Another calendar-connected artifact we will put in display in the exhibit is a daily guide that belonged to Baltimore businessman Mendez Cohn, who is not to be confused with his uncle, the war hero and adventurer, also named Mendez Cohn, about whom we did an exhibit called The Amazing Mendez Cohn. It is a part of Jewish tradition of mourning to light a candle for a loved one on the anniversary of their death. Of course, as we heard before, the date, keeping track of the date of their death involves knowing on the Hebrew calendar, not the Gregorian calendar, and you need to know what time of day it was so you know which Hebrew day it is. In this book, shown on the screen now, the younger Mendez, the nephew, has put a yahrzeit reminder in handwriting on a list of important days. Jewish astronomers look to the night sky to find precise order in terms of time. Jewish astrologers look to the stars to find clues to human destiny. To be clear, the Hebrew scriptures, and in particular the prophets, decry the work of astrologers and plead with people not to rely on them. But as this 1907 book on astrology illustrates, their admonitions were not always heeded. In fact, one of the most well-known expressions in Hebrew and in Yiddish, Mazel Tov, commonly used to mean congratulations, literally means good stars. It derives from a folk belief that our fate is foreshadowed by the stars. One of the most vocal opponents of these folk beliefs was 12th century doctor and religious scholar Moses Maimonides, sometimes called the Rambam. Maimonides wrote extensively on the topics of astronomy and astrology, in the first instance helping to synthesize the work of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers with the scholarship that was emerging from the Arab world at the time that he was writing. As for astrology, he found it incompatible with Jewish beliefs in human free will. But Maimonides is just one of a number of important contributors to astronomical science in the Middle Ages. Two others who will be covered in the exhibit's timeline are Abraham Bar Chaya, a prominent 12th century astronomer and mathematician, known for his first solution to the quadratic equation, and Levi ben Gerson, sometimes called Gersonides, who managed to deduce that the stars are 10 billion times farther away from Earth than Ptolemy and the Greeks had suggested. In other words, in the 13th century, this man articulated something approximating the true size of outer space. Now, while the golden age of Spain produced some impressive astronomers, it is not the end of our story. Across the globe and across the centuries, Jewish interest in the study of space continued, yielding perhaps the best-known scientist of all time, Albert Einstein. Now, the nitpickers in this audience may point out that Einstein won his Nobel Prize for his work on photoelectric effects rather than his theories on space, time, and gravity. Please, you don't need to send me emails. All I have to say to you is, no photons, no photon torpedoes. Einstein's work definitely belongs among the stars. Einstein, however, is not the first Jewish winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. That honor belongs to Albert Michelson, the man who put the C into MC squared. His experiments in measuring the speed of light would later be complemented by instruments he designed to measure the size of stars. There are many things to be measured in space. Dr. Vera Rubin measured the rotation of galaxies. Her life was also a measure of social change. She was just the second woman astronomer elected to the National Academy of Sciences. And in January of this year, it was announced that this observatory that you see here, which is being built in Chile by the US, will officially be called the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, the first facility of its kind in the world to bear the name of a woman. Some astronomers gain fame for research, others simply for popularizing science. In the latter category, one Jewish practitioner stands out. The Brooklyn-born son of an immigrant garment worker, Carl Sagan traced his interest in the wonders of the universe to an early childhood visit to the 1939 New York World's Fair. Sagan was admitted to the University of Chicago at 16. He left 10 years later with a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics. He led the team that put together the first message from Earth to potential aliens who might live beyond our solar system. What you see here is a plaque launched on Pioneer 10 in 1972. But I remember Carl Sagan for his public television program, Cosmos, and the billions and billions catchphrase that he popularized. This section of the exhibit ends with the profile of an astronomer who is still active and here in Baltimore today. Nobel Prize laureate Adam Rees, the grandson of refugees who fled from Germany in the 30s, is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in Space Studies, Astronomy, and Physics at Hopkins. One of Dr. Rees's primary tools in providing the evidence that he has found is the amazing photography and data collected by the Hubble Space Telescope. And while its namesake, astronomer Edwin Hubble, is definitely not Jewish, several prominent scientists at Baltimore's own Space Telescope Sciences Institute have been Jewish, and they will be explored in our mounting of the exhibit.
Yeah. Oops. Okay. Where are we? So Jewish contributions, though, can also be seen behind the scenes rather. So Steven Spielberg in Close Encounters, and also E.T., but also in the musical scores of films that have been written by Jewish composers, such as Jerry Goldsmith and James Horner, who wrote the scores for Alien and Aliens, respectively. We're also planning to introduce into the exhibit a theremin interactive, celebrating the pioneering work of Bernard Herrmann in introducing that creepy electronic sound into The Day the Earth Stood Still.
And a bonus, you can play a theremin without touching anything. So it was made for the pandemic.
Perfect for our new world. So Hugo Gernsback is not the first author of science fiction, but he is the one to give that name to the genre. And he also publishes the first magazine, Astounding Stories. You can see a copy here. The Luxembourg-born Gernsback was originally attracted to the field of electronic gadgetry, and he helped found the Wireless Association of America, an organization for amateur radio enthusiasts before World War I. When his interest in technology morphed into speculation about the future of inventions, he was in the right place to help found a fan movement for science fiction. While in his own lifetime, he was accused of unscrupulous dealings with the authors who provided the content for his publications. Today, he is best remembered as the namesake of the Hugo Awards, the equivalent of an Oscar or a Pulitzer for those who are writing science fiction. We were very excited when we realized that the exhibit would be opening within the centennial year of Isaac Asimov's birth. Or at least we think that's correct. There is some ambiguity as to the exact date he was born, but this seems to be the best we can get. The Asimov family came to America from Russia when Isaac was just age 3. Though Asimov's works of science fiction, such as the Foundation trilogy, I, Robot, and Nightfall, have all become classics, the exhibit also makes note of the fact that Asimov wrote on practically every topic imaginable, producing a library of more than 500 books as an author or editor. As you can see here in this elevation on the right of your screen, we will invite visitors to see how they stack up in Asimov volumes. On the other hand though, the Asimov history raises some fundamental questions about the significance of the fact that so many sci-fi authors came out of Jewish homes. Asimov, for example, while born into a Jewish family, identifies as an atheist and a humanist as an adult. Most of his writings have no explicit Jewish connection, though an important exception to this was his decision to write a story and the foreword for The Wandering Stars, seen here, a collection of 13 short stories on Jewish themes by Jewish authors. A recurring theme in these stories is a question of whether Jewishness is a matter of biology or ideology or ritual making one Jewish. In one story, a creature described as a pillow with tentacles wins acknowledgement as being Jewish. In another, it's a Yiddish-speaking blue caterpillar. Asimov himself sets a tone for the volume in his introduction. He writes, "My mother is Jewish and my father's mother was Jewish, and that makes both my father and myself Jewish." Continuing, "I don't do anything about it, you understand. Attend no services, follow no rituals. It doesn't matter. I am Jewish." So as I mentioned, the contributions of Jewish comic book writers and illustrators was its whole exhibit, Zap Pow Bam, 7 years ago. But Futurama deserves a special mention for its numerous Jewish references. There are the Yiddish intonations of Dr. Zoidberg and the multi-tentacled beast called Yivo, named in honor of the Yivo Institute, where a friend of the writer for that episode worked. Close observers of the exhibit will notice that several of the items and the photos on display in the show actually come from the Yivo Institute. But perhaps the most remarkable sequence in the series is this bot mitzvah. That's B-O-T as in robot mitzvah. With a robot being carried aloft in a chair and a misspelled Hebrew banner in the background that reads, "Today I am a robot," it parodies the expression associated with the bar mitzvah, "Today I am a man." So now let's turn from the first bot mitzvah in space to the first rabbi in space. Babylon 5 was perhaps the only space drama series to feature an explicitly Jewish major character. Played by actress Claudia Christian, Susan Ivanova is the lieutenant commander of the space station. In the episode pictured here, TKO in season 1, her resistance to mourning for her father is oddly paired with a second storyline about a martial arts contest. Her rabbi, played by Theodore Bickel, comes to the Babylon 5 station to persuade her to sit shiva for her father. I'm certain though that many of you know this wasn't Bickel's only sci-fi role. Perhaps more notably, he also played Sergei Rosensko, the adoptive father of Lieutenant Commander Worf in Star Trek. And so then let's turn to Star Trek. So of course we're going to have to start with the Jewish origins of the most famous alien gesture in history. Leonard Nimoy drew on his Orthodox Jewish background to suggest the famous greeting between Vulcans for the episode called A Mock Time. putting his hand in the shape of the priestly blessing, the letter Shin, which would not be a positive result for Jeffrey Hoffman's dreidel game, but probably pretty spot on for right now in compared to our normal handshake. Nimoy is just one of a number of Jewish actors associated with the Star Trek franchise. This includes not only major characters like William Shatner and Walter Koenig playing Kirk and Chekhov respectively, but also minor characters like Sarek, Spock's father, played by Mark Leonard, or Arnie Davin, the man who starts to trouble with tribbles, played by Charlie Brill. While there are no explicitly Jewish characters in the franchise, the whole underlying feel of Star Trek leads me to suggest what might be a controversial conclusion. So though sci-fi is not an inherently Jewish genre, I would argue that Star Trek is at least Jewish, while in contrast, Star Wars really isn't. This idea isn't based upon the actors from the show, rather it is something a little more fundamental. Star Trek, famously pitched as Wagon Train to the Stars, features ensembles of wanderers, many of whom are seeking to find their own identities. Spock, Data, Odo, and the EMH, seen here, among others, are positioned as living between the human world and a very alien identity. It's not just Seven of Nine who's struggling with the issues of assimilation. These characters seem to be in search of a sense of belonging. They are roaming the universe to find their place. That resonates with the search of the Jewish diaspora community, seeking their own place of belonging. By contrast, the Star Wars universe, with its roots in Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, is all about the emergence of a singular hero or villain, the Ubermensch, who will either save or destroy humanity. Its central questions are about destiny rather than identity. And so it's because of this that we will also be displaying the text of the 4 questions from Passover Seder in Klingon rather than Wookiee, for example. Well, that combined with the fact that we are very, very likely going to be welcoming to the museum Mark Okrand, the individual who invented Klingon, likely this October.
Thanks, Trillian. I remind you all that this whole story began with a joke, and so on a joke, we will finish. In 1964, comedian Alan Sherman wrote a song about Harvey Bloom, the astronaut, sung from the point of view of his father, Mr. Bloom. With references to Seder and corned beef, there's no question the Blooms are Jewish. I'll remind you, at that point in '64, there were no Jewish astronauts, and Star Trek had yet to record its first episode. Full disclosure, I had never heard this song before we started talking about this exhibit, but I understand it is well loved, so if you feel like singing along, feel free. But remember, in space, and when you're on mute, no one can hear you sing.
My name is Mr. Bloom and I'm from New Rochelle, and I sing this happy tune because my son, the astronaut, young Harvey Bloom, has landed on the moon. My wife and I, we miss our little Harvey so. Back here in New Rochelle, that every single night, in the pale moonlight, we walk out on the patio and yell, shine on, Harvey Bloom. Up in the sky, you have been in orbit since January, February, June, and July. Don't come back too soon. We rented out your room. So shine on, Harvey Bloom, up there on the moon.
So if you want to start putting your questions into the Q&A, now is the time. And while you're doing that, I am going to answer one burning question. Is JMM open? The answer is yes, but in limited ways. You can visit 15 Lloyd Street right now if you buy or reserve your ticket in advance. We are open 3 days a week, Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, from 10 to noon and 1 to 3. You do have to leave at the end of your time slot. And unfortunately, we are unable to do tours of our historic synagogues right now because the cleaning demands of COVID-19 are contraindicated for historic woodwork. If you want to learn more about JMM, the Jews in Space exhibit, how you can visit in person, I'm going to ask Laura to please share our URL, and then a second one of our hands-on family activities site that we developed in conjunction with this exhibit. I say hands-on, it's as hands-on as anything can be these days. And now it's time for your questions. And my colleague Rachel is monitoring. Rachel, you want to share with us?
We have one particularly good question at the moment, which someone asked if we ever saw any conflict between astronomy and Judaism the way we saw with the Catholic Church in Galileo, for instance.
I am unaware of any such conflict, which is not to say that it didn't exist, but
yes, so I actually know a little bit about this, and that is correct. Because there is no anti-science interpretation in the original writings of the Torah, there was never any systemic conflict between astronomers and religious officials, which doesn't mean there weren't individual conflicts in other communities and individual congregations, but overall, because of, as mentioned in the talk, how important being able to read the sky was, astronomers at the time were often rabbis and other religious officials themselves.
Thank you. I see William Linden has asked whether or not ETs, I assume you mean extraterrestrials, non-Earth-bound creatures, have a share in the world to come. What a great question. I feel like that is the kind of question that we put before two rabbis and get 3 answers.
Hey, I was just thinking, so William, I'm going to say thank you for joining us again. I'd spotted your name at our last couple of programs, so it's lovely to see that you made it out for the full set. And it's interesting because I think the rabbi last week was sort of maybe heading in that direction. And I think for people out there, like, there certainly was this conversation as to whether or not an extraterrestrial could be Jewish. But this certainly is taking us to a next level. So maybe it's one I will hold on to and maybe bring back Rabbi Yogev and a couple of his colleagues and ask them to find it out, as Tracie suggested.
Yeah, let's get those 3 answers.
Right.
So we have another question about would Orthodox Jews be less likely to be astronauts?
I think it depends on who their rabbi is, because as I said in my section, there are some authorities who say, because of the question about when, how to treat sunset, you know, that there are those who say just don't go. that's a reason not to go. But there are other authorities who actually figure out an answer, and so I think both Dr. Hoffman and Ilan Ramon were observant in their own way. And so I think the question is not, to me, this is my answer, but is actually not whether they're less likely to go to space, but whether they're less likely to serve in the services that end up leading to space flight, whether it's the Israeli Air Force or American. Often American astronauts also go through the services. So that's my opinion, but that's my answer.
We had another question in the chat about when we expect the exhibit to open to the public.
I think I will happily answer that question, but Trillian, you had another answer to the
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the other things to think about with the whether or not someone who is Orthodox could become an astronaut. One of the considerations that actually Rabbi Yogev spoke about last week was just actually food. So all of the food is being processed by NASA at this point in time. Nothing is sort of untouched, unprocessed, and so actually that is probably one of the bigger considerations is for someone who is keeping kosher whether or not they can stay kosher in space. So
right.
Just another
if the NASA food has been under proper supervision, which clearly it probably hasn't.
Definitely not at this point.
That's a good point. Actually, Laura, do you mind putting the links to Rabbi Yogev's lectures in the chat, please? Because I think for those of you who are interested in that particular question, Rabbi Yogev really delve deep. So the question was, when can you come see the exhibit in person? And the answer is, right now we are aiming to open on September 13th, which is a Sunday. Obviously, in this age of COVID-19, everything is subject to change, but our current plan is to open on that day.
So I think it looks like, Rachel, did we get all the questions?
Yes, we did.
Okay, well in that case, I'd like to say thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us this evening. As a reminder, you've got all of the links over there so you can listen to the prior presentations, you can learn more about the exhibit as well. I want to say thank you to all of my colleagues that were here this evening, Tracie, who you've seen, Rachel, Laura, and Tracie Dorfman, who I think is still around somewhere. Thank you so much for helping us out this evening. We hope to see all of you guys out there in the audience very soon back at the museum. And just as a final reminder, as you leave the program this evening, you will be directed to a survey. If you can take a second to complete that, it would really, really help us out in our planning process. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.